Hi everyone, I'm JD from Willowbound Journals, and in today's video I am going to share all the books that I read in 2024 as well as my top 10 books from the year. So this is for all the book lovers out there. I absolutely love books, and last year I really got back into reading and I read 40 books. So this is going to be a pretty long video, I imagine, a chatty video. So feel free just to put this on in the background while you do some crafting, and hopefully maybe you'll get some books to add to your reading list. Or maybe there's a book that you have already read that I will mention and you'll have fun hearing my thoughts about it. And yeah, feel free to share in the comments your favourite books that you read from 2024, or if you read any of the same books that I did and your thoughts on them. So the first book that I read in 2024, I have a list. I wrote a list of them all in order. So that's what you can see here. I wrote a list of them in my Daphne's Diary planner. And so I'm just transferring those over into my reading journal, which I used to, in that reading journal, record the books that I read, my thoughts on them, a rating out of 5 stars, but I sort of lost interest in that project, but I still want to record all the books I read. So from now on, how I'm using this journal is to just write a list each year of all the books I read, and I have other little notes. Like this year I'm also including the date that I finished a book, and I highlight my favourite books, and I star the books that were page turners. They might not necessarily have been a favourite book, but I finished them very quickly, so I want to note that down as well. So yeah, I'll probably share a video in the future about how I rate my books. I've got a bit of a system, and let me know if you're interested in that, and I can share that sooner rather than later. And yeah, just share how I record my books and the notes I want to include. I was thinking of doing something like recording like a one-liner to sum up my thoughts about the book, or even I have another journal, my yearly journal, where I record favourite quotes from books, or quotes that really speak to me or that give me an insight. Sometimes I take notes in a separate journal about the books that I read. And this year I've even taken to highlighting my books and actually writing on the pages, annotating my books for the first time. I've wanted to do that for many years now, and finally this is the year that I've done it. And I've got a whole bunch of tabs as well to tab my favourite passages and quotes. So yeah, I'm loving books. It's so fun. Anyway, let's get back to the books that I read in 2024. So the first one was All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten by Robert Fulghum. Is it Fulghum or Fulham? Not sure. And this is a book that I've read a few times in the past. So this was a reread to get me started. I actually found it in the op shop. So I read it and I loved it again. Because you're never sure. Like sometimes with a reread, you're not sure, will I love this as much as I did the first time round? But as soon as I started reading it, I was reminded of why I love this book. It's a book of just short little snippets of this author's thoughts and insights about life, daily observations, that type of thing. And it's my type of writing. I wanted a copy of this book for myself because, not just a reread, but because it inspires me in terms of the types of books that I want to write. I want to write my own version of his book, of my own daily observations and insights. So yeah, love that book. The next book is The Prodigal God by Timothy Keller. I do quite enjoy Timothy Keller's books. All the ones that I've read of his, I've enjoyed. And so yeah, The Prodigal God, it was worth reading. And yeah, quite challenging, very convicting, gave me some insights and some things to work on in my own life about my own attitude, and just waking me up to my own arrogance, and opening me up to new perspectives, and hopefully to, more character building, more maturity, more grace, and yeah, my cat Keanu is helping me to journal, which is lovely. The next book that I read was recommended to me by my sister, actually. She had read Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, and I absolutely loved it. It was actually one of my favorite reads for the year, a very surprising read. It's a fantasy novel, and at first I was a bit wary because, it's about dragons, and I was like, oh gosh, dragons have been done so many times before. What is this going to do? Is it just going to be the same old, same old? But no, it was so good. I loved the world building. There were some issues with it, I know, but overall I loved the world. I was in it. I loved just the setting, the history, and the dragons were my favorite part. The dragon characters were just wonderful and delightful, and loved the world building, just loved being in that world. So Fourth Wing was one of my books in my top 10. The next book I read was Before the Coffee Gets Cold, Tales from the Cafe, which is the sequel to Before the Coffee Gets Cold, the first book. It's by Yoshikazu Kawaguchi. I'm probably saying that totally wrong. I really loved Before the Coffee Gets Cold. I read that, I can't remember if it was the year before that or the year before that. But anyway, I absolutely loved that book. It was one of my favorites for that particular year. That would have been in the top 10 that year. And it was so insightful, so tender, heartwarming, so moving, and gave me some lovely quotes and insights that have stuck with me even to this day. So I knew I definitely wanted to read the sequel, and I think there's now at least 4 books in the series, if not more. The second one, I feel like I needed to read it straight after the first one to be in that mode. I sort of forgot the characters, as that was a little tricky navigating that again. Because I kind of knew what to expect now, it didn't hit me with that newness anymore this time. So I actually found it a little bit forgettable this time. It was still like a cozy read, but I didn't get any insights from it this time. So I think, the first one, it was just, I had never read a book like it before. It had a very interesting writing style, and it took me a while to get into it at first. But once I just went with it, the heartwarming insights were just so tender. Anyway, so the next book I read was called Bright Shining by Julia Baird. And this was a sequel to another book that she wrote that I read in a previous year that would have been in my top 10 that year as well, called Phosphorescence. And this book was all about, I think it was all about grace. Yeah, I was going to say hope, but it was about grace. And like the meaning of grace, and it was a chapter about forgiveness, and I didn't enjoy it as much as Phosphorescence, but still a good read. I still enjoyed it, and I would definitely read more from this author. The next book makes it into my top 10 for 2024. It is called The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. This was recommended to me by a friend who is an avid book reader, and this is one of her favorite books, and she introduced me to a whole new genre. I never had heard of it ever before, dark academia, which is amazing because, I've been a book lover my whole life, and to be introduced to a whole new genre, it was like, what is this genre? I didn't know there were these other genres. And I really enjoyed it. Dark academia. I think I like it because I'm a bit of an academic myself. I have studied 3 courses in my time, and I always was saying how would say that I would gladly be paid to study. I loved assignments, I loved essays, I loved deadlines, I loved, my uni days were my best days. I call them. The best time of my life was when I went to uni, and sitting in a lecture theatre just felt like home to me. I love learning. I just want to soak up all the learning and attend every lecture I possibly can on interesting topics. And so I think I love that part of it. I love the heady intellectual nature of dark academia books. I love learning as I'm reading. And yeah, anyway, so really enjoyed the Atlas 6 and the mystery element of it too, and sort of the friendships element as well, where the characters often have, well, in the dark academia books I've read so far, form a friendship as they are going through their academic year together. Anyway, the next book that I read was actually an audio book. I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy. And this one, I really enjoy audiobooks when it's read by the actual author. So I feel like they can inflect it where they need inflection. They know how to read it with all of the nuance that, because they wrote it. So it's really good listening to audiobooks from the actual author. And this was riveting. This was actually a page turner. So that would have a little star next to it. I couldn't stop listening. I finished it in 2 days. It was absolutely riveting. And I love memoirs. I love learning from people, and I love hearing people's stories and what they can pull out of it, their insights from their life that they've lived. So that was a memoir, very sort of controversial title, but yeah, just hearing her story, and I love how as well when they read it from their own voice, it comes alive. And to be able to be, what I love about memoirs is you get to live someone else's story without having to live their story, if that makes sense. But you get all their wisdom through what they've gone through. And the next book that I read is called A Child Unfinished by Susie LaFond. And she did the Liberate course that I did with Sabrina Ward Harrison. And so I kind of want to read every single person's book who published one through Sabrina Ward Harrison's Liberate course. So that's one of those books. They're just so beautiful. I got it as an ebook, as a PDF, and it's just, sort of, similar like mine. The people who do the Liberate course produce books that are more of magazine style, like a visual memoir. So again, I get to live someone else's story and glean their wisdom from that journey. The next book I read was Iron Flame, again by Rebecca Yarros. This is the sequel to Fourth Wing. Didn't enjoy it as much as the first book, but still definitely wanted to read it, and definitely want to read Onyx Storm, which is the new release and the third in the sequel. So I will be reading that for sure this year. The next book I read was called Atomic Habits by James Clear. This was recommended to me by Sabrina Ward Harrison in her course, Liberate. I read it, and to be honest, I didn't really enjoy it. There's some non-fiction books I really struggle to read when they seem too, formulaic. I just found it a little bit like I could have got all that information from a blog post, which is not a bad thing, but I didn't need a whole book on it. So it wasn't that enjoyable for me to read. This is part of my rating system. I want to know, can I learn something from it? Yes, I did learn some things, but I feel like he could have written it with just one sentence instead of a whole chapter to get that insight. So is it enjoyable? Do I learn something? Two kind of different elements. So some books I didn't enjoy reading it at all because I found it to be plodding, hard to get through, or boring, or too much jargon, that kind of thing. But the insights I got from it were like mind-blowing. So, that book I could still give a high rating to, but I wouldn't want to read it again. But I would definitely love to, I needed to have read it, and I'm glad I read it, if that makes any sense. So the next book I read was You Could Make This Place Beautiful. This makes it into my top 10 by Maggie Smith. This was another memoir, and it just blew me away how it was written, by the structure. So what I loved most about this book was how it played with structure. Some chapters were a single word or a sentence. Other chapters were your more traditional, paragraphs. Some chapters repeated, some titles of chapters repeated. It was brilliant. I absolutely loved it. I want to go through it with a fine-tooth comb. This is another book that inspires me as a writer. I want to study how she does it. I want to learn from it, and I want to write a book like it, in my own version of the book, obviously. It just mind-blowing book. I absolutely loved it. That was another page turner. Read it so quickly, couldn't put it down, but it was the structure of it. It wasn't so much the content that I enjoyed, it was the structure that just fascinated me. Anyway, the next book that I read was called Fire by Kristen Cashore. I found this in an op shop, and I read one of her books called Graceling in the past that I quite enjoyed, and so I read Fire, which is in the same world, sort of like a prequel, and again, it wasn't as good, but I don't know, it was just a fun read, There was nothing necessarily mind-blowing about it, but there was a little bit of a mystery, fun little twists here and there, and yeah. The next book that I read makes it into my top 10. It is called Anxious People by Fredrik Backman. I love Fredrik Backman as an author. I have enjoyed most of his books, and found all his books worth reading. Anxious People, he wrote A Man Called Ove. That was the first book I read by him, and that book, A Man Called Ove, was one of my top books for that year that I read that one. And so that made it my top 10 that year. So Anxious People, even better. Oh, this was one of the best books. I found it at the op shop again, and it was so good. It was such a fun book, but it was so heartwarming as well. All of the characters were flawed, but you just loved them anyway. And it just made me cry so much at the end as he was wrapping up all the stories at the end of each of the people's stories. I cried for each of their stories, and then it just hit me so powerfully at the very end, like the insight at the very end where you just made this one last connection. It was just like connection after connection after connection where you're just like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then finally the last one, it hit me and just made me cry. It was such a good book. I definitely want to reread that. The next book was called The Perks of Being a Wallflower. That had been on my reading list for quite a while. Again, I found it in an op shop. So good. By Stephen Chbosky. I'm not sure how to say that. There's a lot of consonants there next to each other. And that one actually, it was a page turner. I just picked it up and I was like, I'll just read a few lines and just get a feel for it, and then I'll go back to what I was doing. I couldn't put it down. It was because you were in the character's voice straight away, and I love those types of books where you just pick it up and you're instantly in the character's voice. John Marsden, he is classic for that for me. The Tomorrow When the War Began series, I can just pick up that book, and from the first sentence I'm in it. I feel so connected to the character, and they feel so real to me. I love finding books like that. And so that's what this book, it sucked me in because I was just with the characters, so connected to them. The next book that I read was called And Every Morning the Way Home Gets Longer, again by Fredrik Backman. It's more like a novella, very, very, very short. You can read it in one sitting very quickly. Not my favourite book again, but still worth reading. They tend to be kind of philosophical, heartwarming stories. The next book was The Wartime Book Club, and this was the first book that I read for the book club that I joined, the local book club where I live, and that was one of my highlights in 2024, that book club. Each month we read a different book that a different person chose, and it started off with a winner. The Wartime Book Club was one of my first historical fiction books that I ever read, and I really enjoyed it. I was quite surprised. And from then I started reading more historical fiction. The next book I read was called House of Hollow by Crystal Sutherland, which was the second book that I read for the book club. and I was quite excited about it. It said it was like a modern fairy tale fantasy. So I was excited going into it, but I didn't like it in the end. Didn't really like that book at all. I felt there were a few little plot holes or just some things I didn't quite put together or understand. Wasn't a huge fan of the ending. Yeah, so that one I didn't rate very highly. The next book I did rate very highly. It made it into my top 10, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. This is another non-fiction book, and this one's all about solitude and silence and Sabbath and slowing down, all things that I love. This book is so powerful. I recommend it for the Willow Book Club that I run. This is one of our books for January. So this year I'm choosing 2 books for the book club for each month. Last year I just had 1 and it was all non-fiction. This year I'm doing 1 non-fiction and 1 fiction book each month. So I chose The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, so I read that again this year to set up my year. And so good. It was so good. I highlighted so much, like almost every page has highlighting in it. And this book, what I love most about it is not just the insights that it gave me, but practical change. I've made practical changes in my life, daily practical changes from this book. So good. The next book that I read was called Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake, which was our first book, I believe, for the Willow Book Club. And again, I had high hopes for this one. My friend recommended it to me, and I just did not like it very much. At first, I liked it. The first half of the book, I very much enjoyed. The second half, I started not liking it. The characters kind of took a turn and didn't really like the characters anymore. The next book I read was called Freetown by Otto de Cat. I got that from the library and it was recommended to me by the librarian. A very short book, very interesting. Haven't read a book like it. It's more of like a literary fiction book. It made me think, so it was worth reading. Very fascinating. It sort of made me think more in terms of how did they do this writing. So again, that's another category of how I rate books. Did I learn something? Was it enjoyable? And then the third category is sort of how did they write it? And was there something that I could learn from that? Maybe I didn't get any insights from the content itself, but I learned from how they went about it. And I don't know, it was thought-provoking, I'll give it that. The next book that I read makes it into my top 10, and this is probably in my top 3, Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is a dark academia book, and it was, one of my absolute favourite reads from last year. It was so good, so good. And this was a book that I chose for the Willow Book Club as well. It was amazing. It was a fantasy, sort of almost historical fiction, but the fantasy element was so, not that much, and just slotted so seamlessly into the world. And it was just fascinating stuff about translation I learned about. I learned about all this amazing stuff along with the book, along with the fiction elements of it. And very thought-provoking. What I love about this book in particular was that, yes, it was a fiction book, but it really made you look at real life through new eyes. That's the sign of a good fiction book, when it can make you look at your world with fresh eyes. So good. The next book that I read was The House in the Pines by Anna Ries. This was a book for book club, the local one that I'm part of. It had its moments. In the middle, it was a page turner. It's a thriller, mystery thriller. But again, I wasn't happy with the ending. It's kind of one of those books where it was like, and it was all a dream. That's not what it was, but it had that sort of letdown element to me once you found out what the mystery was. The next book I read was a historical fiction biography. The Naturalist of Amsterdam by Melissa Ashley. This was so fascinating. Hadn't read a book like it. A slow, cozy read. It was interesting. I found out that I don't particularly, cozy reads aren't my favorite, but I do enjoy them. I enjoy them, but what I want from a book is a page turner. I want thriller. I want not necessarily like the thriller genre, but thriller book in terms of thrilling, gets me turning those pages. Those are my favorite books. The slow, cozy reads, though, I will say, not bad. I do quite enjoy them, just not my favorite. I always have a kind of a wrestle with the slow, cozy books. I have this kind of love-hate relationship with them almost, where I'm like, I'm enjoying it, but I'm also taking forever to read it, which I feel like I'm fighting with the book if it's taking forever to read it. Anyway, it was worth it though. It was quite interesting. The next book was called The Atlas Paradox by Olivia Blake, which is the sequel to The Atlas 6. I liked it, but again, not as good as the first one, and I found it quite dark and not as enjoyable because the characters kind of took a turn and were a bit more independent, whereas in the first book they worked together and it was so intriguing, the different dynamics between the characters. In this one they kind of went off on their own a bit more and it wasn't as interesting, and it was a bit darker, but I'm definitely looking forward to reading the third and final book in that series for sure. The next book that I read was called Honeybee by Craig Silvey. This is for the local book club that I'm part of, and this was quite a page turner, especially at the start. Quite an interesting book, again, not like anything else I've read, and it was one of those books where I was in the character straight away, so that's why I was a page turner, and also like quite an intense read, and so it drew you in straight away, and you just go on this journey with the main character. And the only thing that I didn't quite like about the ending was it was too fairy tale. It was too Cinderella, where it became a bit too unbelievable by the end. All of the book up until then had been so rooted in gritty and real and raw and lifelike. And then the end, it was like, oh, it just wraps up and happily ever after Cinderella, which totally can work as well for what it might have needed. But for me, I was just like, oh, now this becomes unbelievable. And I wanted it to stay still with a happy ending, but more realistic, if that makes sense. The next book was The Book of the People by A.N. Wilson. And this would just make it into my top 10 because this is one of those books where it wasn't particularly the most enjoyable book to read, but it gave me so many insights, so much treasure from this book where I really enjoyed those insights. A book about how the Bible has always been shaped by people, and it's not necessarily this clean-cut, neat thing, but a thing that is shaped as people are also in connection with the word and learning about it, and it's dynamic and it shifts and it changes and it can change through the centuries, and it changes with people as they read it, not just as with the writers, but whoever's reading it and the audience. It's this dynamic relationship, and that's so cool, so cool. The next book I read was called Beyond the Mirror by Henry Nouwen. Again, kind of philosophical, theological book, so there were some really nice insights in there, but a very short book as well. You can read it very quickly. Worth a read though. The next book I read was called Circe by Madeline Miller. I had read A Song of Achilles in a previous year, and while it was an okay read for me, I didn't find it particularly great. It wasn't my type of book, basically. Circe, I did enjoy more, but it was one of those, it kind of reminded me of Castaway, the movie, which I don't really enjoy those types of movies. Just a lone person on an island. Things come and go and things happen, but yeah, I very much enjoyed the ending of the book, though, towards the end when stuff actually started to happen and when there was actual character dynamics happening, and that was really good. Character progression and all that kind of thing. The next book that I read was Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. This one I had been putting off for so long. I'd seen it and I thought I wouldn't like it, to be honest. There were other books that looked similar to it that I had read that I didn't enjoy because I felt they were too sort of surface level, superficial, a bit too teenagery, if that makes sense. And again, there's nothing wrong with these types of books. It's just not the type of book I'm looking for. I want depth. I want intellectual books. I want philosophical books and to be made to think. But this book, totally, so glad I read it. It was so different to what I expected. It had depth. It was more like a scientist writing a book about the natural world, which was quite lovely. And the mystery sucked me in. It took me 2 days to read it. It was a page turner. It has a star next to it. The mystery was great, sucked me in. And yeah, it was good. Surprisingly, it was good. The next book I read was called Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. Mendel, which is a science fiction book that was part of the local book club I'm part of. And yeah, this was one of those books where as I was reading it, I wasn't sure if I was enjoying it. I didn't think I was enjoying it. But by the end, it's one of those books that stayed with me. And that's a sign of a book that is definitely worth reading. So there's another category. There's those types of books where as you're reading it, you're feeling like, oh, this is nothing special. But when you finish it, if you're still thinking about it a week later, a month later, a year later, then you have to give it a high rating, I reckon. And that's what this book did. When everything sort of came together and wrapped up in the end, it did give me that aha moment and philosophical ending, the ramifications at the end where you're just like, oh, wow, yeah, I can see that conflict, that dilemma, and I can see that moral question there, and it really makes you think. And I love that when a book can make you think, and that's what that book did for me. So I think the journey of reading that book was worth it in the end to get all of that at the end. The next book I read was called Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett, which I think was a book that I chose for the Willow Book Club. And this is a book, again, where all the time while I'm reading it, I'm like, I don't know if I'm enjoying this, because it was one of those, it's a slow, cozy read. And like I said, I don't tend to enjoy those ones as much, the slow, cozy reads. I always feel like I want to enjoy this more. I want to go quicker with this. But this is one of those books where when I finished it, I was so delighted by what I just read and was so thankful for this world that I had just entered. And it's one of those books that has stayed with me after I finished it to this day and that I think of fondly. So I did actually really enjoy it. A slow read, but so charming, so delightful. And yeah, I reckon I would give it a go to reread in the future. So then I went on to read the sequel, Emily Wilde's Map of the Other Lands. Again, not as good as the first one, but still a nice cozy read. I think the first one just kind of, that might make it into my top 12 actually, that book. It was pretty good. I think what I've learned though is I'm just not that interested in books about the fae, about fairies. There's a whole genre about the fae and the fairy genre where the fairies have their own sort of lore and their own sort of myth about them, sort of like Greek mythology, which is what Circe was, Greek mythology, by the way. There's so much to say actually about Circe. What I did like about Circe was it gave Circe a voice, told it from her perspective as opposed to a male-centric perspective, where you get to be sympathetic towards her and understand where she's coming from. So that was really cool to kind of look at that dynamic. And so I love how that made me think in that way. So where was I going with that? Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies was my first book that I read in terms of the fae and the fairies. And I just don't really like the fae. They're kind of creepy to me. And I kind of like the kind of mischievous, if not downright malicious. And I don't really like reading about malicious characters. It's not my cup of tea. So anyway, but this book I did like. The Encyclopedia of Fairies one anyway. The next book I read was called Leave the World Behind because I had watched the movie first. I didn't know it was a book until after I watched the movie. And the movie, my goodness, it was tense. I was on the edge of my seat. It was a tense one. I really enjoy thrillers, not scary thrillers. I don't like creepy thrillers. What I like is thrillers that can make you think, mystery thrillers, those ones. Can't do any scary movies, but I love mysteries where I have to be engaged. I need to work out puzzles. I like those types of thrillers. So, and that movie had so many layers to it, like social class, race, economics, war, justice, social justice, ethics, morality. Like, it had made me think about so many things that made me look at our world through new eyes, that kind of thing. So I wanted to read the book and sort of compare it to the movie. I love doing that kind of thing. Film analysis, book analysis, and seeing how they tell stories well in different mediums. So yeah. The next book I read was called Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. I loved his book, The Martian, really good book. And then this one I read when I was sick. I was sick for a week, like quite sick. So I was bedridden and I read that book while I was sick and I really loved it. At the start, it took me a while to get into it because it was a bit too teenagery-ish, teeny bopper-ish, kind of surface level, superficial. Didn't really like the main character's voice. But as it kept on going, I love all the sciencey part of it. That's quite fun. And what I loved especially was, okay, so a bit of a spoiler, I guess. There's a robot that comes into it, like an alien robot thing. And at first when the robot alien came into the picture, I was like, oh no, here we go. This is going to be so, I don't know, boring, cliche, whatever. But this book made me fall in love with that alien and he became my favorite character, if you can call it a he. And I found myself crying for this character and so that's why I love this book, because it made me care for a character that I thought I would not care about. So it changed my whole perspective. Loved it. The next book I read was called Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, a classic. I had read this in high school at a time when I wasn't into books the way I am now, where I want to analyze them and appreciate them the way I do. So pretty short book, read it in one sitting. It was for the local book club. Did I say that already? Can't remember. It's a bit of a hard read. I'm not sure if I would ever read it again, but it's an amazing classic in terms of, a model of succinct writing that is just no word wasted. It's like a poem, literary fiction, and so many themes that you can wrestle with. It stays with you. It's just kind of a bit of a horrific story and I was not having fun reading that book. The next book I read was Yellowface by R.F. Kuang because I loved Babel, so I wanted to read this book by the same author. Totally different genre, my goodness. It's kind of a horror story, not terribly creepy or scary, but as I was reading it, I was like, this is a bit of a horror story. As the main character sort of descends into madness. But it's quite interesting following that character. It was a page turner, read it in 2 days. It has a star next to it. It just sucked me in. It drew me in, like the whole time you're like, what happens next? What happens next? You just have to find out. You have to find out. And you sympathize with the main character. You totally understand where they're coming from. They're relatable. And then it just gets worse and worse and worse. And you're just like, nope. Anyway, the next book I read was called The Illuminae Files by Jay Kristoff and Amy Kaufman. I was really interested in this book because I got into ergodic literature, which is like different types of structure. And like I said, I love reading books with different types of structures that play around with structure. And the premise of this book is like it's a whole bunch of files. It's a story told through the files. So there's like an interview, and there's like video footage that they have a transcript for. They have an email that you have to read, and there's like conversations in a chat room that you read to be able to flesh out the story. And I wasn't really having fun throughout it. It was the story itself and it was a bit more surface level, kind of teeny boppy style book. Again, nothing wrong with that type of book. It's just not my type of book that keeps me interested. But towards the middle, there was a lovely twist that I really enjoyed. There, again, I'm probably giving spoilers here, but there's like an AI that sort of takes over. And that was fascinating. Reading the AI perspective, that was that part sucked me in. And when you realise a twist, that was kind of mind-blowing and wonderful, and made you want to kind of read back to see it coming and that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know, in the end, not my favourite book, but worth reading still. Next book I read was for the book club, the local one I'm part of, called 9 Perfect Strangers by Leanne Moriarty. And I actually enjoyed it. It was quite surprising. I had read another book by her in the past and didn't really enjoy that one. Could have taken it or leaved it. This one, though, I was quite pleasantly surprised. Took me a while to get into, but each of the people, obviously there's 9 of them, you get to read their stories, their perspectives, they alternate. And I quite enjoyed reading all of their stories, which is fun. It was quite witty, quite funny. One of the main characters who had most of the story told through her perspective, she was just a riot. She was a blast. So that was quite fun. It was a fun read. Nothing like life-changing about it, no great insights, but it was a fun read. The next book I read was called You Don't Have to Have a Dream by Tim Minchin. This makes it into my top 3 for last year. It's a non-fiction, very short, can read it in one sitting, and this is another one of those books that I absolutely love for not just the content and the insights and the lessons learned, but for the inspiration for me as a writer. I want to go through this with a fine-tooth comb and write my own version of it as well. So good, so good, so good. The final book that I read last year, the 40th book, was called How to Be Perfect by Michael Schur. It is a book about philosophy, but written in a way that is so readable. Such a good way to write a book where he just talks about his own journey of learning about philosophy and him trying to seek out how to be. The title is a bit of a witty title. It's not to be taken literally. Obviously, he says like no one can be perfect. That's not what this is about. It's tongue-in-cheek, the title, but about how to live morally, and he goes through all the different philosophical theories out there of how to be moral and he shares like his model of what he relates to best and what he goes by, and loved it because this is my life question. My whole daily existence is how can I live the best that I can? How can I live the most moral life I can? And so every day I feel like I fail, and it was so nice to be able to read this book, to see that someone else was asking the same questions that I ask that daily run through my head. It's just a constant question. How can I live the best life that helps people? How can I live the best life that is worth something, that matters in this world. It can feel so draining sometimes to have this as a constant thing running through my head and having that feeling that I'm constantly failing as well. So this book gave me some really good tips to help me not be so hard on myself and to know I'm not alone in being a person who, this is my driving thing. This is my driving question that I ask every single day. And so, it gave me some good tips to manage that question and live a bit easier with those questions that I live with each day. That was such a good book. I would definitely reread it. It was quite intensive though. Like there's a lot of material. It covers very deep, very, very deep. So it gave me so many insights though, some concepts like the Overton window and the happiness pump. I finally learned that you can't be a happiness pump, or I would call it a morality pump. And before reading this book, I actually thought it was possible that you could be a happiness or morality pump, meaning that it was possible to, do your best at every minute of every single day and be completely moral every single day, which obviously, like, I know in my head, of course, that's not possible. Of course, it's not possible. But somewhere deep down, I was like, but I'm striving for that every day. And so I was even crying reading the book. It made me cry because I realized, one, someone else has this question, feels like this too. And two, it's not even possible. And oh, what a relief that is. And also, I guess, just that realization that I had that burden on my shoulders, that I thought it was possible. And no wonder, like, daily life for me was a constant struggle because I always felt like I was failing every single moment of my life. It felt like I was failing at living a moral, life. And so, this book was very, 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 very helpful, and definitely think I want a copy for myself so I can highlight those lessons and really take them to heart and live them out. So that was a good book to end the year. So thank you so, so much for watching. I hope that this video was interesting and helpful. If you are a book lover, maybe you got some book recommendations for you. I love that I have a top 10, maybe even a top 12. I was considering mentioning like my top 10 in order, but as I was looking at them, I was like, I don't think I can rate them. Like, maybe I could force myself to do it, but there's so many that I love and for different reasons. And that's why I don't think I can rate them, because, for example, I love Babel. Babel was one of my all-time favorite books from last year, for the entertainment factor, for just the world. Whereas, you don't have to have a dream. I loved it equally as much for a different reason though, for the insights it gave me, the lessons it gave me, and for the inspiration it gives me to write my own books. So, and then How to Be Perfect, that's another one I love for a whole different reason, because it made me feel seen, it made me feel understood, and it gave me some actual practical tips for living my life and change my perspective. I love a book that can change your perspective. And as well, I love books, even if I don't enjoy them, even if I don't like the book, I love reading them, because I feel like you can always learn from every book you read, whether you learn more about what you like reading or what you don't like reading, whether you learn about what worked for you, what didn't, in terms of their writing style, the voice, the character. Like, when I'm reading, I'm analyzing it not just as a reader, but as a writer. Like, what have they done to make me feel this way? What is it that makes me like this? What is it that makes me not like this? And that's why, as well, I hesitate sometimes to say if I don't like a book, or the reasons why I don't like a book, because this isn't me knocking the book and saying it's a bad book at all. That author did a great job writing. It just wasn't for me, that's all. And just because I found a book boring or uninteresting, or didn't get anything out of it, or didn't find it memorable, that does not mean it was a bad book. It doesn't mean it's a book not worth reading. It was still worth reading. I can still learn from it. And the great thing is there's other people out there who will love that book because that's their thing. There's a book out there for everyone, right? So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for learning and growing, and learning as a reader, learning as a person who lives in the world, and learning as a writer. That's what I love. I'm looking at reading through those three lenses. As a reader, is it enjoyable? Is it entertaining? As a person who lives in the world, how does it make me live in the world differently? And then how does it make me see differently? And then finally, as a writer, how does this influence my writing? How does it inspire the books I want to write? I love that. I don't know. Do you have categories like that? If you're a book lover, I'd love to hear, like, what lenses do you read a book through? Or are you not even thinking about that? I know some people don't even bother like with analysing, and you don't want to bother with that because you just want to be immersed, you just want to enjoy it or not enjoy it, and that is great too. That is so great as well. We all have different ways of reading. So cool. Anyway, I could go on and on about books. This is already a really long video, and I've looped the video as well. So if you stayed with me this long, let me know in the comments, what is your favourite book that you read in 2024? I'm always looking for recommendations. And if you've read any of the books that I read, please tell me your thoughts on them as well. And if you would like to be part of the Willow Book Club, I'll leave the link down below in the description box. You don't have to read the books each month to be part of that book club. It's just there for anyone who wants to read the books. And I mean, the books that I am offering up for each month, honestly, I don't know if anyone would love all of them, because I do read widely. I love reading widely. And like I said, like, my books that I enjoy reading are going to be probably different to a lot of people what they like reading. And a lot of the books I choose, I don't even like reading them, but I want to read them anyway because I want to be exposed to things I don't like, because that helps me be exposed to things that I wouldn't normally be exposed to, that I then can learn from and grow from. So yeah, anyway. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments too. And I will see you all in the next video.
Beautiful
Bye,
patrons
guys.
for supporting me in the month of December. You guys are absolutely amazing. I appreciate you so much and couldn't do what I do without you. If you would like to become a patron, there is a link down below in the description box. And when you become a patron, you are supporting Willow Bound Journals and this channel. And you also get access to extra videos. So the journal making series each month. If you're a Ruby patron, you get access to every printable kit from my Etsy right there over Patreon, including a new kit each month. Going up the tiers, there are mail tiers where you get sent mail to you. The highest tier is the journal tier, where you get a journal sent to you each month. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check that out. You can also become a member or buy me a coffee to support this channel if you would like.